Was the steel ingot a tomb or a time capsule? You know the story of Foreman Elias Vance. You know he fell into the 2800-degree molten steel laid at Republic Steel in Youngstown, Ohio in 1962. You know the physics should have turned him to ash. But what if the metal didn't just consume him? What if it preserved him? Elias Vance was a man of routine. 52 years old, 40 years on the line, counting down the days to his pension. He knew the furnaces intimately. He knew the deafening symphony of industry. That night, October 21st, the roar of the ladle was interrupted by a single, desperate human sound, a momentary slip on the narrow catwalk. Vance plunged directly into the heart of Ladle War, 200 tons of glowing, liquid destruction. The crewmen watched, paralyzed, expecting the vapor, the hiss of annihilation. They saw nothing. The molten iron simply swallowed him, shivered once, and settled. No splash, no smoke. No trace of the man who had worked that factory floor for half a lifetime. The company, running a tight schedule, made the immediate, morbid decision: the pour must continue. Vance was gone. His remains were now chemically integrated into the product. The ladle was cast into a single, massive 20-ton ingot, a solid, black memorial to an instantaneous disaster. 3 days later, the ingot sat cooling in the yard. Night watchman Frank Miller was the first to report it. Not a crack, not a whine of contracting metal. Knocks. Rhythmic, heavy. The sound came from the heart of the iron block, a desperate signal in the factory's graveyard shift. Dr. Alistair Rourke, the lead engineer, a man who worshipped the laws of thermodynamics, dismissed it as thermal stress. But the knocking persisted. Rourke ordered the highly specialized ultrasonic flaw detector brought out. The device is designed to find cracks and bubbles, structural imperfections in metal. But when the sensor hit the ingot, Rourke stared at the screen and knew he was looking at an impossibility. The scan didn't show a uniform mass. It showed a void. A pocket in the exact center of the ingot, shielded on all sides by 3 feet of solid steel. The void was not an amorphous bubble. It was shaped perfectly like a man, curled in a fetal position. The metal hadn't destroyed him, it had cast him. Then came the reading that shattered Rourke's belief system. A long-stemmed sensor was inserted, reading the internal temperature of the anomaly. It wasn't ambient, it wasn't freezing, it was 99.6 degrees Fahrenheit. How does a chamber encased in 3 feet of solid steel, cooled for 3 days, maintain its own independent heat source? Was the metal acting as a perfect thermal shield? Was the extreme pressure of the pour somehow creating an instantaneous phase shift, stabilizing the human body and holding Vance in a state of suspended animation? The question isn't whether Elias Vance survived the fall. The question is, what did the metal do to him? The ingot was deemed unfit for manufacturing and shipped out within hours under heavy security, labeled hazardous material. The official story never changed. Vance was vaporized. But the engineers left behind knew the truth. They hadn't lost a man to a factory accident. They had discovered a physical impossibility. And they had to silence the sound of his heavy, rhythmic knocks. They knew they had sealed not a coffin, but a time capsule. A living prisoner waiting for the steel to finally give way. Did a train steal 10 years? You think you know your local history. You think you know the physics of transport. A train travels at a certain speed, across a certain distance, in a certain time. But what if a train makes a 3-hour journey in 15 minutes? And what if the price of that speed is a decade of lost time? Look at the railway logs of Altoona, Pennsylvania. This city was forged by the railroad, but deep inside the 1908 archive, there is an entry highlighted in stark, unsettling red. A routine freight run, engine 402, fully loaded with industrial steel, left Pittsburgh at 2 a.m., heading east. It was a standard haul along the main line, a grueling 3-hour trip, scheduled to arrive in Altoona at 5 a.m. The station master, Frank Holla, was finishing his second coffee of the shift. The time on the clock was 2:15 a.m. Frank glanced up, expecting nothing but the usual quiet between runs. Instead, he saw the colossal form of engine 102 pulling into the yard. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a phantom. It was the correct engine number, the correct model, gliding silently onto the tracks. The station master ran out, waving his lantern, convinced the crew must have somehow bypassed 3 hours of track work and broken every speed record in history. He climbed into the cab. The brakes were cold. The engine was silent, having somehow coasted the final miles. The engineer, a man named Thomas Cole, was sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead, his eyes wide open but unfocused. His hands were locked on the throttle, knuckles white as bone. Cole was unresponsive. He couldn't answer the impossible question. How did you cover 3 hours and 15 minutes? His body was stiff and his personal pocket watch was frozen solid. But the most chilling piece of evidence wasn't the impossible speed. It was the calendar nailed to the cab wall. It wasn't showing October 4th, 1958. It was showing October 4th, 1958. 10 years in the future. The train hadn't just gone fast. It had ripped a hole through time. Authorities boarded the train to secure the engine and check the cargo. The cargo cars, which had left Pittsburgh full of industrial steel, were now completely empty. The steel was gone, vanished somewhere along the instantaneous route. But the floorboards were covered in a fine, chalky dust. A scientific analysis revealed the dust wasn't coal or rust. It was a unique, brittle basalt mixed with elements that required extremely low gravity to form. Forensic labs delivered the impossible verdict. The floorboards were coated in moon rock basalt. The implication was horrific. Engine 402 hadn't merely arrived early. It had briefly touched down on a completely different temporal and physical plane, shed its cargo, and returned. Thomas Cole never recovered. He was institutionalized, suffering from catatonia. He spent the rest of his life sitting perfectly still, except when he was alone. Then he would move his hands in the air, manipulating an invisible throttle. He was steering, eternally trapped in the 15-minute gap, still trying to guide his train through the black lunar tunnel that only he had ever seen. The railway records officially logged the incident as a psychotic break causing an unrecorded emergency stop, but the employees of Altoona knew better. The train hadn't arrived early. It had skipped time and, in doing though, brought a terrifying souvenir back from a future we weren't meant to see. What if the deepest part of the ocean wasn't thousands of miles away? What if it was waiting for you in your own backyard? And what if, when it called, you couldn't run? This is the terrifying story of Arthur Penn, a man who died fighting the sea while standing on the driest dirt in Ohio. In the summer 1988, northern Ohio was locked in a brutal drought. The land was cracked, the cornfields were yellowing, and the heat was a physical weight. When July 11th, in a remote stretch of farmland 20 miles outside of Bowling Green, Arthur Penn was driving his tractor. Arthur was a fourth-generation farmer, a man whose life was dictated by the certainty of the soil. He was as far from the coast as you could get, standing on bedrock that hadn't seen a significant flood in over a century. Arthur's wife, Mary Penn, was walking across the field to bring him lunch when the tractor abruptly stopped. Arthur climbed down from the cab, placed his boots on the dusty, dry earth, and then he began to choke. Mary described the horrifying scene to the investigating officers. Arthur wasn't grasping at his throat like he'd swallowed something. He was clawing at his chest, his eyes bulging, his face turning a terrifying mottled blue. He was fighting a struggle that simply didn't belong in a dry cornfield under a midday sun. He thrashed for less than 2 minutes before collapsing face first into the dust. By the time the volunteer EMTs arrived, Arthur Penn was gone. Cause of death was immediate, overwhelming respiratory failure. The local coroner, a seasoned veteran of farm accidents, was forced to call in the state forensic team. The autopsy results were not just baffling, they were physically impossible. Arthur Penn had died from acute drowning. His lungs were entirely filled with liquid, 3 liters, almost a gallon. But the liquid wasn't just water. The chemical analysis defied all local geography. It was a complex, chemically unique saltwater solution with a salinity level far exceeding that of the Great Lakes. Most disturbingly, the solution was mixed with a specific strain of halophytic algae, a microorganism that requires extreme pressure and a complete absence of light to thrive. The liquid in Arthur Penn's lungs was an exact, perfect match for the bathypelagic zone, lightless, high-pressure layer of the Atlantic Ocean found over 10,000 feet deep. Arthur Penn had drowned in deep-sea water while standing on dry land in Ohio. Authorities scoured the property. They looked for hidden cisterns, leaking sewage lines, or any possible source of water. There was nothing. Just dust, dried corn, and the crushing blue sky. The impossible fact remained. The deepest part of the ocean had found him. The police officially filed the case as an unexplainable physiological event. But Mary Penn offered a terrifying piece of supplementary testimony that gave the anomaly a sinister narrative. For the last 6 weeks of his life, she said, Arthur had been tormented by a physical sensation. He complained constantly of a crushing pressure in his ears and skull, like he was deep underground, or descending rapidly. He would wake up in the middle of the night gasping, convinced the room was shrinking around him. He told Mary he felt like he was constantly going down, and that he couldn't shake the smell of wet salt and decaying metal. The only rational theory put forth, and quickly buried, was that a temporal spatial rift, a brief, highly localized tear in the fabric of reality, may have momentarily opened around Arthur Penn. This caused a high-pressure exchange. For the span of a single gasp, Arthur Penn's lungs were exposed to the overwhelming, water-filled environment of the deep ocean, instantly forcing the liquid into his body. The tear snapped shut just as quickly, leaving Arthur standing exactly where he had been, but have suffered an impossible, subterranean death. The ocean didn't care where he was standing. It simply reached across time and distance, claimed its victim, and left behind a man whose final moments were spent fighting a force that shouldn't exist in the middle of a dry cornfield. The story of Arthur Penn is a testament to the terrifying truth: if the universe wants you, no amount of dry land can save you. What happens when an abandoned piece of architecture becomes an amplifier for a warning signal? In a forgotten corner of rural Michigan, just outside the tiny town of Cedar Creek, sits a massive grain silo, empty since 1970s, too remote and vast for anyone to bother tearing down. The structure stands sentinel over fields that have long since forgotten their original purpose. Locals have always whispered that on clear, quiet nights, the silo doesn't just stand there, it listens. The official anomaly began in 2005. Amateur radio hobbyists in the area, kind of isolated collectors who searched the airwaves for long-dead military transmissions, began tuning into a specific, non-existent frequency. It wasn't a ham band, it wasn't a public wavelength, yet a signal was there, anchored firmly to the position of the abandoned silo. It wasn't music, it wasn't fragmented conversation. It was a constant, rhythmic, static pulse, like the heartbeat of a massive, dying machine. A serious enthusiast named Roger Davies managed to record the signal and ran it through a spectrum analyzer duct. His immediate conclusion was chilling. The static wasn't random noise, it was structured, patterned, and repeating. It was transmitting in Morse code. The static wasn't random noise. It was structured, patterned, and repeating. It was transmitting in Morse code. Davies spent 3 agonizing days filtering the layers of static to decipher the message, and when he finally did, the simplicity of the warning was terrifying. Do not look up. Do not look up. The message repeated endlessly, a looping, silent alarm broadcast from a dead structure. Davies immediately contacted the Michigan State Police and the FCC, but his claims were dismissed as the ravings of an isolated hobbyist. He then contacted a private firm specializing in environmental audio engineering. They verified the Morse code transmission, but their focus shifted to a faint, hollow sound layered beneath the static. The sound was high-pitched, resonant, and consistent. The acoustic signature was quickly identified. The noise was the simultaneous singing of thousands of cicadas, a deafening natural chorus. But this specific species of cicada, identified by its unique pitch and frequency, had been extinct in the region since 1952, wiped out by a pesticide campaign. The implications are physically staggering. The silo isn't simply picking up a signal. It is broadcasting a warning from a dead species, delivered via a dead technology, originating from a past that is chemically impossible to reproduce. The static pulse is believed to be the power source, somehow generated by the immense metal structure acting as a massive antenna for a pocket of temporal radiation. Davies continued to monitor the frequency until 2008, when the signal briefly changed. The static pulse stopped, and for 1 minute and 12 seconds, the hollow chorus of the extinct cicadas was broadcast alone, full and terrifyingly real. Then, the rhythmic Morse code transmission returned, repeating its silent, desperate plea. No one knows what happens if you disregard the warning and look up at the silo on a clear night. But the evidence suggests that the abandoned steel structure is just a building. It is a receiver for a catastrophic echo, a moment of environmental horror that the universe is constantly trying to warn the present about, using the last voices of the creatures who saw it happen. The Ohio River has seen countless construction projects, but none stranger than the Willow Creek span outside Cincinnati. Intended to link 2 sprawling suburbs, construction began, but due to funding disputes and logistical nightmares, the project was frozen in mid-air. leaving behind a massive, skeletal, concrete and steel frame spanning 3/4 of the river. The project was legally abandoned 20 years ago, deemed too costly to complete and too dangerous to entirely demolish. The bridge should be dead. But every year, inspectors find clear, undeniable evidence that the work continues. The first reports came from bridge safety inspectors who noticed discrepancies in the structural integrity reports. New rivets are hammered into the steel girders, freshly seated and sealed. Fresh scorch marks appear on the support pylons high above the water. Used, discarded welding rods, some still warm to the touch, are found scattered on the incomplete bridge deck. These aren't just modern additions. The tools used are antique, heavy iron implements from the 1940s, too large and clumsy for any modern construction crew. The welding techniques themselves are obsolete, dating back to the post-war industrial boom. The work is performed silently, entirely without a power source and without a living crew. The phenomenon culminated in 2017. A small crew was finally contracted to remove a section of older, structurally unstable steel from the eastern approach. They spent a full day cutting away the damaged girder, documenting the work with time-stamped photos. They secured the site and left. When the crew returned the next morning, the section they had cut and removed was back in place. It wasn't a crude patch-up. The steel was seamless. The bolts were tightened beyond industrial specification, and the welds were chemically fresh, yet performed with the same archaic 1940s technique. There were no fresh tire tracks leading to the site. No power supply had been connected. The sheer tonnage of the steel replaced required massive cranes, but the surrounding mud was undisturbed. The only explanation that makes sense is that the bridge is assembling itself. Driven by a phantom crew caught in an endless silent shift, the Willow Creek span refuses to remain a monument to failure. It is driven by a structural imperative, forced to fulfill the purpose for which it was originally designed, regardless of the laws of physics. The span remains unfinished to this day, an impossible puzzle of decaying and brand new metal. Inspectors refuse to visit the site after dark, afraid that they might witness the terrible, tireless effort of the phantom construction crew. The bridge continues its silent, relentless crawl across the Ohio River, a structure built by the work that never stopped, waiting for the day it finally links two places that may not even need the connection anymore. What if you could see the moment of your death, not through a vision, but through a piece of glass? What if the past, present, and future all decided to exist in the same room? This is the story of the old Astor Hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, and the basement chamber that broke the rules of time. The Astor Hotel was a grand building from the Jazz Age, but after a devastating fire in 1932, the entire structure was heavily renovated. One specific area, deep sub-basement, was never reopened. It was sealed off with poured concrete and a heavy riveted steel door. For 60 years, the door remained untouched, a silent tomb beneath the bustling city. In the 1990s, during a major structural overhaul of the Astor, a demolition crew rediscovered the sealed access point. Curiosity and the smell of potential history overcame caution. They pried open the heavy steel door. The air that rushed out wasn't hot or smoky, it was freezing cold, carrying a faint, dry scent of ozone and dust. The room they found was a shock. It was pristine, completely untouched by the 1932 fire or the intervening decades. It was a perfect square chamber, and the walls were lined entirely with massive, framed mirrors, floor-to-ceiling sheets of polished, antique glass that gave the small space an unsettling illusion of infinite depth and infinite reflections. The first hint of the anomaly came from a crew member named Jeff. He set his toolbox down with a thud and happened to glance up. He noticed his reflection in the mirror opposite seemed wrong. Jeff moved his arm quickly, but the man in the glass lowered his arm slowly, deliberately, staring at him. The lead foreman, Mickey Donovan, an old-school skeptical type, immediately dismissed it as an optical illusion caused by the density of the mirrors. He decided to test it. Donovan moved his hand in a sharp wave. His reflection waved back, but the movement was clearly lagging by a full 5 seconds. The entire crew watched in horrified silence as the phenomenon escalated. The reflection started moving independently of the men. They weren't mirroring the present, they were mirroring the immediate past of the room. A reflection of a crew member who had left minutes ago could be seen walking back through the door in the mirror, smiling at a joke that had already been forgotten. The room was not reflecting the now, it was displaying a 5-second temporal delay. Then the reflections went completely rogue. They began moving ahead of the men. One moment the mirror showed the pristine room, the next it showed the same room covered in debris, the light fixtures smashed, a vision of the room 5 seconds into the future. The crew panicked and fled, slamming the heavy steel door shut, but the evidence had been captured. One worker, driven by morbid curiosity, had snapped a single, blurry photo on his disposable camera as they ran out. When police later analyzed the photograph, which showed the empty, mirrored room, they saw the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. In the deep background of one of the infinite reflections, they could clearly see Mickey Donovan falling backward, slamming his head against the sharp corner of a concrete abutment, an event that had not yet happened in the real world. Donovan was immediately put on medical leave and banned from going near the Astor Hotel, but the mirror's prediction was relentless. Exactly 3 days after the photograph was developed, Mickey Donovan was involved in a freak accident at a separate job site. He slipped on a patch of black ice, fell backward, and hit his head on the concrete curb outside his work site, sustaining the exact injuries seen in the reflection. The mirror room was sealed again, permanently welded shut this time. The conclusion was inescapable. The sheer density of the mirrored surfaces, perhaps interacting with the residual temporal energies of the 1932 fire, had created an echo chamber for time. It was not a mirror reflecting light. It was an apparatus reflecting destiny. And in that room, the future was never safe. The winters in the far northern reaches of Michigan's Upper Peninsula are brutal. They are defined by deep, paralyzing snow and piercing cold that freezes the bone. But in the small, almost forgotten mining town of Black Creek, the winter of February 1950 brought an atmospheric event that defied meteorology, geology, and history itself. The residents woke to a world painted white. It looked exactly like a fresh, heavy snowfall, kind that blankets the landscape in perfect silence. Children, excited by the fresh powder, rushed outside to play, but the silence didn't last. A collective scream of surprise echoed through the quiet town. The white powder wasn't cold. It was warm to the touch. When children picked it up, it didn't crystallize or stick. It melted instantly upon contact with bare skin, leaving behind a strange, oily residue and no visible moisture. It wasn't snow. It was ash. But it fell silently, softly, like powder from a sieve, covering the town in a layer that measured nearly 6 inches deep. The air carried a faint, deep smell of mineral sulfur and burnt pine. The local authorities were baffled. There were no reports of fires within hundreds of miles. The nearest mountain range was dormant, and the region has no history of volcanic activity. This was a massive, widespread weather event delivering heat-treated debris, yet the source was utterly invisible. The ash was collected and sent for analysis to the state university. The forensic report delivered a result that broke the chain of cause and effect. The material was comprised primarily of silica, calcite, and trace amounts of petrified wood. It was the remains of ancient, slow-burning timber, a massive, forest-level disaster. The conclusion was reached through carbon dating. The ash that fell on Black Creek in 1951 was determined to be over 3,000 years old. Geologists confirmed there were no dormant volcanoes or active deep-earth coal fires within 500 miles that could explain the phenomenon. The atmosphere simply manifested the aftermath of a prehistoric disaster. The local sheriff, Robert Lindley, filed a desperate report detailing the event, but the state closed the file, labeling it a bizarre, unconfirmed atmospheric dust event. But the reality was far more terrifying than dust. The warm snow phenomenon lasted precisely 4 hours. Then, as abruptly as it began, the fallout simply stopped. The sky cleared completely, leaving the ground dry and covered in 3,000-year-old ash. The locals developed their own terrifying name for the phenomenon: temporal ashfall. They believe the entire region is somehow prone to a leakage in time, a vulnerability that allows the raw, processed results of ancient, catastrophic events to briefly slip into the present day. The implications are overwhelming. If the remnants of a 3,000-year-old forest fire can suddenly appear in the sky, what else is waiting to leak through? A massive ice age? The blast wave of an ancient meteor strike? The event proved that the air above Black Creek isn't just space, it is a thin veil separating the present from the deepest, most violent geological past. To this day, when the wind blows hard over the empty silo of Black Creek, the residents worry that the next anomaly that slips through won't just be warm ash, but the fire itself. The Drexel Building in downtown Pittsburgh is a towering testament to 1920s architecture. It stands 22 stories high, its steel frame an enduring symbol of industrial permanence. Every floor is accounted for, clearly marked on the elevator panels, the fire escape plans, and the original blueprints. Yet, in 2008, a seemingly routine maintenance job revealed that the Drexel Building had been lying for 80 years. The anomaly was discovered by Dennis Weaver, a veteran elevator technician tasked with upgrading the building's archaic electrical system. Dennis was working deep inside the main shaft, recalibrating the complex signal lines that control the cars. According to the architecture, between the 12th and 14th floors, there should only be the empty maintenance shaft and heavy structural supports. But when Dennis checked the wiring harness, he found something impossible. The signal lines for the 13th floor were fully intact, active, and sending a current to Mayada. The wires were marked as placeholders. They were live, leading nowhere according to the blueprints. The 13th floor doesn't exist. It never did. It was omitted during construction, a standard practice due to superstition, leaving a double-height void. Out of overwhelming, professional curiosity, Dennis knew he had to try. He bypassed the safety interlocks and jury-rigged a sequence to activate the phantom button labeled 13 on the car's control board. The elevator car ascended past the 12th floor with a shuddering, violent jolt. Instead of sailing smoothly into the gap below the 14th, the car abruptly slowed, stopping with a soft, unsettling metallic sigh. The doors slid open to a scene that should have been physically impossible. Dennis stepped out into a dimly lit hallway. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled distinctly of ozone and fresh paint, chemical scent of new construction, decades after the building was finished. The light was harsh, fluorescent, and humming loudly. The hallway was a perfect, bizarre duplicate of the 21st floor high-end executive suites. But there were subtle, terrifying differences. All the doors were black, unmarked steel, devoid of plaques or handles, and the heavy dust and decay that should have defined an 80-year-old unused space were entirely absent. Everything was surgically clean. Dennis felt the deep, cold pull of primal panic. He turned to flee, reaching for the call button to return to the lobby. The moment his finger made contact with the plastic button, the plastic didn't move, it vaporized. It turned into a puff of ash that stung his eyes. The entire panel seemed to reject his touch, locking him out. He ran back toward the elevator car, which thankfully hadn't moved. As he slammed the door shut, he caught a final glimpse down the hallway. He saw a brief flicker of movement at the far end of the hall, near the fire stairs. A tall, unnaturally thin silhouette moving with a strange, gliding speed. Trapped, he pulled the emergency brake line, cutting all power to the car. The elevator dropped several floors before the emergency locks caught. He escaped the car on the 9th floor and immediately quit his job. The official conclusion was that Dennis suffered a pressure-induced hallucination while working in the tight shaft. But Dennis knew the truth. The Drexel Building was finished exactly as the plans dictated, 22 floors. But somewhere, during the build, the sheer force of construction had created a dimensional ghost floor. The physical space between the 12th and 14th floors was occupied by a structure built of the right materials, but in the wrong time. A clean, cold floor that exists only when someone activates the phantom current, built and maintained by architectural will rather than physical stone. And whatever was gliding down that clean black hallway was maintaining the impossible floor. Deep in the rugged hills of Kentucky, where the forests are so thick the sun barely penetrates the canopy, the environment holds secrets that defy the most fundamental laws of nature. On maps, it's labeled simply as Ravens Creek, a modest tributary flowing down a steep, rocky ravine, but in one isolated, heavily shaded section, the water commits an act of continuous, physical impossibility. For a stretch of approximately 30 feet, the water of Ravens Creek flows uphill. This isn't a geological trick, an optical illusion, or a cleverly hidden siphon. Numerous witnesses, from casual hikers to expert local guides, have confirmed that the water visibly churns against the natural gradient of the stone. It flows with a persistent, forceful energy, fighting gravity as if driven by a massive, powerful pump hidden beneath the earth. The most unnerving element of the anomaly isn't the sight, but the sound. Locals who live near the valley claim that on quiet nights, the uphill flowing water emits a low, powerful humming. It's a deep, resonating sound, often described as mechanical and heavy, like the cycling of a massive submerged machine perpetually running below the bedrock. The constant sound suggests an artificial power source, yet there are no power lines, no infrastructure, and no signs of drilling in the remote area. In 1991, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dispatched a small, discrete team to study the phenomenon, labeling it an extreme hydrological anomaly. They spent weeks charting the precise gradient of the land, confirming with laser accuracy that the water was indeed flowing at a persistent 2 to 5 degree uphill angle. The team then began experimentation. They lowered several weighted, non-buoyant tracking markers into the creek below the anomaly. The markers were instantly caught by the impossible current and were carried upward against the force of gravity until they reached the highest point of the flow point where the creek should have begun its downhill descent. But the markers didn't stop. They didn't sink, nor did they get stuck on the rocks. At the exact moment they crested the high point of the vertical flow, they disappeared. One marker was equipped with a high-end GPS transmitter. The engineers tracked its position as it was carried upward by the impossible current. At the precise geographical coordinates where the uphill flow ceased, the GPS signal vanished instantly. The marker didn't just stop transmitting. The physical object seemed to cease to exist in that location, leaving the engineers with an empty signal where a heavy metal object should have been. The Army Corps concluded their classified report with an admission of defeat. They speculated that the area contains a localized gravitational or energy sink, an unknown subsurface force that is not only generating immense power to drive the water uphill, but is also consuming physical matter at the point of origin. The Ravens Creek anomaly isn't just fighting gravity, it is feeding into something. To the locals, the vertical river is a terrifying reminder that the earth beneath them is not static. They know that the water that disappears at the crest of the flow is traveling to an unknown, hidden plate. Dark, pressurized destination that only the mechanical pulse of the creek knows the way to. And whatever is creating that unnatural, powerful hum is demanding a constant, material sacrifice. In rural Indiana, the old Oak Haven schoolhouse stands perfectly preserved, a wooden relic shuttered after consolidation in 1968. It's an artifact of a simpler time, filled with dusty desks and the faint scent of chalk dust and dried ink. Its most valued possession, still hanging behind glass in the abandoned principal's office, is the 1957 class photograph. The image shows 32 smiling children and 2 stern-faced teachers, all lined up in front of the school's brick entrance. But the anomaly appears when you perform a simple count. When local historian Evelyn Reed began cataloging the school's archives in 1999, she cross-referenced the photo with the official enrollment ledger from 1957. The ledger listed 31 students attending the Oak Haven schoolhouse that year. Investigators meticulously cross-checked every name, every birth certificate, and every local family history. They confirmed the terrifying discrepancy. There is one student in the photograph who was never registered, never attended, and never existed in the town's entire documented history. He is a boy, maybe 8 years old, with stark white hair and a wide, unsettling smile, standing right in the center of the front row, holding a slate that reads, Class of 57. The mystery of the 13th student terrified the small community. Was he a prank? A trick of the light? In 2003, a specialist hired by a paranormal research group used a high-powered forensic magnifier and darkroom techniques to analyze the antique silver halide prints. The first thing they noticed was a physical impossibility. The boy with the white hair is the only subject who doesn't cast a shadow. Despite the bright midday sun visible in the photo, the space immediately behind him is flat, shadowless light. But the most terrifying discovery was in the boy's eyes. When forensic tools magnified the reflection visible in the boy's pupils, they weren't reflecting the light of the camera flash, the school entrance, or the 1957 sunshine. They were reflecting the principal's office as it looks now, dusty, empty, and decaying. They were reflecting the room the photo was hanging in. The boy in the center of the photograph is an artifact of the past. He is an observational anomaly. He is a student that the collective energy or memory of the school somehow wanted to exist, and in the moment the flashbulb fired, he materialized as a temporal insertion, a non-existent child frozen between 1957 and the empty present. He is the spirit of the abandoned schoolhouse, perfectly placed in the history that never happened, and forever staring out at the decay it became. The community eventually locked the principal's office, unwilling to share the silence with the boy who watches them from the past. The highway that skips time. The stretch of Interstate 70, formerly the historic Route 40, running through western Pennsylvania, is notorious for its heavy, isolating fog and its long, monotonous drives. For decades, truckers traveling this route have whispered about a consistent and disturbing phenomenon known only as the Route 40 blink. The event begins without warning. Drivers will be moving along the desolate road, sometimes at midday, sometimes under the cover of night, when for a fraction of a second, the entire sky, the road, and the immediate world around them will flash bright cobalt blue. The light is blinding, overwhelming, and utterly silent. It is, quite literally, a blink. When the light fades, the driver immediately finds that they have covered a distance that is mathematically and physically impossible. In 2015, a long-haul trucker named Gary Nelson reported the most extreme incident. He was driving westbound, having just passed the town of Breezewood. He blinked during the cobalt flash, and when his vision cleared, the highway signs confirmed he was nearly 90 miles down the road, suddenly approaching the suburbs of Pittsburgh. Nelson immediately pulled over, terrified. He checked his vital signs. His watch showed only a few seconds had passed since the flash. Then he checked his truck's instruments. His fuel gauge hadn't dropped an ounce, and his odometer had not moved an inch. According to the truck's internal record, he had been parked for the duration of the 90-mile journey. Yet physically, he was 90 miles away. He arrived at his destination early, shaking but relieved. But when he opened his bill of lading for the delivery, the time stamped on the paperwork showed he was 3 hours late. The receiving dock foreman confirmed that the shipping trackers had shown his truck offline for approximately 3 hours, exactly the time required to drive the distance he had just instantaneously covered. The terrifying conclusion reached by underground researchers and fellow truckers is that the Route 40 blink isn't merely confusing time. It is creating a temporal shortcut by exploiting a weakness in the local geography. During the cobalt flash, the space around the vehicle instantly contracts, allowing the truck to traverse the distance without the vehicle itself registering the movement. The truck's components, engine, the odometer, exist in the true present, while the highway surrounding the truck briefly travels faster than the vehicle within it. The light is the ignition of a localized, short-range warp. The true horror lies in the paperwork. The universe knows he was 3 hours late, even though the truck traveled instantly. Time keeps its own score, and the blink only allows physical location to cheat, leaving the driver's reality and sanity in pieces. The deepest, darkest story in the Rust Belt belongs to the abandoned Willow Creek coal breaker in West Virginia. The breaker, a massive rusted structure of steel and concrete used to process raw coal, has been silent for over 40 years. Its power lines cut, its purpose obsolete. But for the small, isolated communities that live in the valley below, the silence is often broken. People swear they can still hear the breaker working. At dusk, especially when the valley air is cold and heavy, a cacophony of impossible sound fills the air. It's the grinding of the massive flywheel, the shuddering of the conveyor belts, and the screaming hiss of the steam vents. It is the full, deafening sound of a massive industrial operation, running without power, without coal, and without a crew. In 2011, a local photographer and amateur sound engineer named Mark Nolan decided to document the haunting. He set up high-grade recording equipment near the base of the defunct structure. His audio tape confirmed the impossible. The mechanical operation was captured, clear as a bell. But when Nolan analyzed the acoustic signature, he made a terrifying discovery. The sound was not originating from the rusted breaker above ground. The sound waves, when analyzed using deep earth acoustic mapping, were found to be originating from 500 feet beneath the valley floor. The structure of the breaker, though silent above, was somehow still running in the deep subterranean darkness. Nolan's investigation led him to old mining surveys. Beneath the Willow Creek breaker site sits the deepest, most dangerous vertical shaft in the state. Long flooded and filled with explosive methane and water. It was a shaft so deep it was deemed structurally unrecoverable. Nolan quit his investigation shortly after making his final recording. He noted that whenever the audible grinding and clanking of the breaker sounds finally stopped, a new, far more unsettling sound would immediately begin. It was a slow, deliberate tapping, coming from the exact coordinates of the submerged methane-filled shaft. The tapping wasn't random, and it wasn't Morse code. It was a rhythmic, continuous beat, like the heavy metallic sound of a massive machine trying to break its way out of the ground. The implication is that the structural imperative of the old breaker, forced to continue its work, somehow transferred its entire operation to a deeper, more primitive mechanism below the earth. And that mechanism, fueled by the pressure of the flooded shaft, is now trying to claw its way back to the surface. The town that fell asleep in the night. You know the feeling of a small town after midnight. The quiet streets, the single, glowing street lamp. The sense that everyone is safe in their beds. But what if, one night, the entire town went to sleep and simply never woke up? Not to death, but to a deeper, more terrifying state. This is the official, buried record of what happened in Jericho Falls, Nebraska. Population 1,142. The event is logged as a mass psychological event by the CDC. The state police report call it anomalous. But the radio transcripts from that night tell the real story. It began on October 17th, 2013 at precisely 11:07 p.m. The 911 dispatch center in the adjacent county received 17 identical calls from Jericho Falls within a 90-second window. The calls weren't emergency, they were confused. Slurred statements. The callers, a night nurse, a trucker fueling noob, a teenager on a porch, all reported the same sensation, an overwhelming, sudden fatigue, like a weight of dark water pushing them down. Then, the line from every call went silent. Not dead. You could still hear open microphones, the soft sound of breathing, of fabric rustling, of a television left on. But no one would speak again. State Trooper Mara Jennings was the first responder, arriving at the town limits at 11:22 p.m. Her dashboard camera captured the scene that would define the anomaly. Every house on Main Street was lit. Cars were parked at angles, some still running. The gas station's pumps were on, nozzle hanging from a sedan's tank, but there was no movement. Jennings found people exactly where they had fallen when the fatigue hit. The night nurse was slumped over her kitchen table, head on her arms, as if taking a quick nap. The trucker was curled on the concrete by his rig. The teenager was lying on the porch swing, gently swaying. They were all alive. Their pulses were strong, their breathing deep and regular. But they could not be roused. Shouting, shaking, even mild pain stimuli, nothing. It was as if the entire population had been switched into the deepest stage of REM sleep simultaneously, their minds locked in a shared, inaccessible dream. The National Guard sealed the town. Medical teams in hazmat suits moved in, expecting a pathogen, a gas leak, a toxin in the water. They found nothing. Brain scans showed unprecedented, hyper-synchronized delta wave activity across every subject, a perfect, town-wide brainwave lockstep. It was a biological impossibility. Then the teams made a second, more chilling discovery. It wasn't just the people. The animals were asleep too. Dogs lay in the middle of yards. Birds had fallen from trees onto lawns. Flies were motionless on windowsills, but the plant life was different. The grass was an unnaturally vibrant green. Flowers on porches had bloomed explosively, petals wide and glistening with moisture in the arid night. It was as if the vitality, the waking energy of every conscious creature had been siphoned out and fed directly into the soil and the flora. The most compelling and terrifying evidence came from audio analysis. Engineers set up parabolic microphones around the sleeping forms. When the ambient noise was filtered out, a faint, collective sound was isolated. It wasn't snoring. It was a low, resonant, harmonic hum, barely on the edge of human hearing, emanating from every sleeping person's throat. When played back at slowed speed, the sound resolved into a distorted but recognizable pattern. The distant, deep-frequency vibrations of roots growing, of tectonic plates shifting, of the earth itself turning. The official operation lasted 2 weeks. Then, as abruptly as it began, the event ended. At 3:33 a.m. on Halloween, every single person in Jericho Falls opened their eyes. They were weak, disoriented, but physically unharmed. They had no memory of the lost time, no dreams, just a gap. The town was reopened, life resumed, the official reports were sealed. But the investigators who were there know what they witnessed. Jericho Falls didn't suffer an attack, it performed a function. For those 2 weeks, the town became a single, living battery. The synchronized sleep of its inhabitants generated a specific, low-frequency energy that was absorbed by the land itself. The question that haunts the few who saw the data is, what caused the sleep? It's what was that energy used for? What, deep in the Nebraska bedrock, needed to be fed by the collective unconscious of an entire town? And is it still hungry, waiting for the right frequency of sleeping minds to align once more?